Great. So I welcome everybody. Thanks for coming out today on this warm spring day. There is some water and I think snacks outside in case you need any. So my name is Todd Presner. I'm a faculty member here at UCLA in the Department of European Languages and Transcultural Studies. I'm the chair of that department, and previously was the director of the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies, our Levy Center. So I'd like to welcome you today to the talk with Professor Sam Kassow, and he's going to present, as you know, on a recent work of translation and historical, let's say, reconstruction, called On the Warsaw Testament, which is a book that also received recently the National Jewish Book Award in the category of Holocaust memoir. The book is available for purchase after the event today. And just a couple of notes about the program. This is made possible by the Levy Center in partnership with the Michael and Irene Ross program in Yiddish Studies. I do want to thank the Levy Center staff, including Chelsea, David, and Vivian, for helping to make the arrangements possible. We are recording the event, just so you know, and it's made available online shortly after we have the in-person event. To that end, it is important to silence your phones. And if you have to take a phone call, please just step outside. Don't do it inside the room here, since, again, we are recording things. Very briefly, let me just introduce our speaker. Many of you may know him through this really, to me, like life-changing book, Who Will Write Our History, which is a book about the Onig Shabas archive, buried, as many of you know, in the Warsaw Ghetto and headed up by a man named Emanuel Ringelblum. He'll be talking about one of the survivors who worked closely with Ringleblum, Rokhl Auerbach, whose biography and story and writings are not as well known, unfortunately, but now I think through the new publication of the Warsaw Testament certainly will be and deserve to be. And I think there's a picture that you'll see of her because she was there with the 10 boxes as they were dug up with these extraordinary archives, one of 3, I believe, archivists who survived and could go back and help people find. And you'll learn much more about this than I will possibly summarize. But this book is extraordinary because it's also a testament not only to the belief in the future of humanity, but also the importance of history and the archive and the possibility of testimony, especially when there's so few survivors who lived. So Samuel Kassow is the Charles H. Northam Professor of History at Trinity College. He holds a Ph.D. from Princeton and has been visiting professor at many institutions and has actually been a guest at UCLA, as he reminded me, really since the 1980s. And so it's really a pleasure to have him back today. He's worked most recently with a team of scholars internationally on the POLIN Museum on the history of the Jews in Warsaw, we have more amplification, right? And among his books, as I mentioned, Who Will Write Our History, Emanuel Ringelblum, and the Secret Ghetto Archive. This book came out in 2007, won numerous prizes, including a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. More recently, Rokhl Auerbach's Warsaw Testament, published by White Goat Press, received the National Jewish Book Award in March of 2025, so just about a year ago. He is also the child of Holocaust survivors and spent his earliest years in DP camps in Germany. So I'm going to turn the floor over to Professor Kassow. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And we've had quite a winter back in the East, so it's a pleasure to feel this warmth. I'm talking today about a remarkable and until recently a largely forgotten woman, Rokhl Auerbach, who dedicated her whole life after the war to preserving the memory of the Holocaust. And her experience, her life, reflected the tensions and the ruptures of East European Jewry in the 20th century. She spent her childhood in a remote village in the foothills of the Carpathians, now in West Ukraine. She then lived in Lvov, where she participated in that rich multi-ethnic urban culture of Ukrainians, Poles, and Jews. Then she moved to Warsaw, where she was part of that fractious and intense Yiddish literary world. And then, of course, she became a member of the Ringleblum archive staff in the Warsaw Ghetto. Helped by Emanuel Ringelblum, she left the Warsaw Ghetto just in the nick of time, in March 1943, just before the outbreak of the ghetto uprising. And with a fake ID card and with a new Polish name, Aniela Dabrucka, Auerbach becomes an intrepid courier for the Jewish underground. Day in and day out, she's risking her life to deliver messages and money to Jews in hiding. And then in the evenings, she would write. After the war in Poland, she joined the Central Jewish Historical Commission and did pioneering historical research. And we used to think that serious Holocaust research didn't begin until the 60s and 70s. Actually, it began in Poland in 1945, except nobody knew about it because they couldn't read the languages. She left Poland for Israel in 1950, and she starts the Survivors Testimony Division at Yad Vashem. And she plays a very important behind-the-scenes role in the Eichmann trial, where she urges Gideon Hausner, the chief prosecutor, to put survivor testimony front and center. That is, instead of a narrow legal focus on Eichmann's particular activities and the Nazi bureaucracy, as Hannah Arendt would have preferred, Auerbach made no bones about the fact that she wanted a show trial with victim testimony front and center, a trial that would show Israelis and everyone else who cared to listen what it really meant to be a Jew under Nazi occupation. In the last years of her life, she reworked her wartime writings into memoirs of the Warsaw Ghetto. She managed to finish one volume, Warsaw Testament, which was published in 1974. But she dies in 1976 as she was writing that second volume, Beim letzten Weg, On the Last Road. So I put those two volumes together, and it appeared in English as Warsaw Testament. Among her wartime writings was a remarkable essay entitled Yizkor, Remember. She wrote it in November 1943. The ghetto was now just a heap of rubble. This is what Warsaw looks like in 1946, standing on the ruins of the former ghetto. Hundreds of thousands of Jews now murdered. And on a dreary day that month, she's riding on a streetcar in Aryan Warsaw, and by now the Germans are stepping up their reign of terror against the Poles. And hardly a week goes by without another mass shooting of Polish hostages in downtown Warsaw. And suddenly, a Polish woman sitting in the same streetcar starts to weep. The Germans had just shot her son, my son, she cried, over and over. And Auerbach thinks to herself, she can weep. I may neither groan nor weep. I may not draw attention to myself in the street, and I need to weep. Not 4 times a year, that's when Jews say that particular prayer. I feel the need to say Yizkor 4 times a day. So that night, she goes back to her room, and the landlady has no idea that she's harboring a Jew, and she begins to write that essay entitled Yizkor. How do you say Yizkor for 500,000 Jews? You say Yizkor for a spouse, for a parent, but how do you say Yizkor for 500,000 people who were totally destroyed and left nobody after them to say the prayers for the dead? And as she's groping for images in Yizkor to explain the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe, she begins with the example of a flood. And here's how she starts. I saw a flood once in the mountains. That's where she was a child. Wooden huts, torn from their foundations, were carried above the raging waters. One can see lighted lamps in them, men, women, and children in cradles tied to ceiling beams. Other huts were empty inside, but one could see a tangle of arms waving from the roof, like branches blowing in the wind, waving desperately toward heaven, toward the riverbanks for help. At a distance, one could see mouths gaping. But you couldn't hear the cries because the roar of the waters drowned out everything. And that's how the Jewish masses flowed to their destruction at the time of the deportations, sinking as helplessly into the deluge of annihilation. Now, why does she begin with the image of a natural disaster, of a flood? I think it's because as she's writing, she could guess what people who weren't there, the kind of questions they were going to ask after the war, like, what happened to those millions of Polish Jews? Why do they let themselves get fooled? But by using the imagery of a flood, of a natural disaster, as my friend David Roskies once pointed out, she anticipated those questions. How do you criticize the reactions of people who were killed in a tsunami? No, the Holocaust was not a meta-historical event. It had to be studied in detail. But its enormity was too horrible and too unprecedented to allow for glib theories and facile questions that might compromise the memory of the Jewish masses that she cherished so deeply. And she vowed that if she survived, she would dedicate the rest of her life to making sure that the world did not forget. And Auerbach never broke that vow, and for the rest of her life, she lived only to make sure that people remembered. Nobody told the story of the Warsaw Ghetto with as much passion and insight. Few worked more diligently to persuade historians, lawyers, journalists, the wider public to listen, really listen, to the testimony of survivors and to remember not just the famous names, but also the ordinary people who went to their deaths. At a time when the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising emerged as the symbol of Jewish resistance and heroism during the Holocaust, it was Auerbach who reminded Jews to think about the writers and the poets along with the fighters, and also to respect other kinds of resistance, and also to ponder not just the trauma of mass murder, but also the deep wound of cultural genocide. There's an Israeli scholar, a legal scholar, Lior Bilski, who's doing very good work on this at the moment. The Germans committed a double murder, the physical destruction of the Jews, but also the erasure of their Yiddish speech and cultural legacy. What Annette Viavorka called the era of the witness came about in no small measure thanks to the unstinting efforts of people like Rokhl Auerbach to highlight the importance of survivor testimony, the Eichmann trial being a key example. At a time when scholars like Raoul Hilberg were arguing that documents were better sources than survivor accounts, Auerbach said, okay, documents are well and good, but they're a source that usually has more to say about the perpetrators than about the victims, since by definition the perpetrators are more likely to leave documents. And anticipating the work of Saul Friedlander and Jan Thomas Gross and others, Auerbach urged scholars and jurists to hear out those witnesses. And as she crafted guidelines for conducting interviews at Yad Vashem, she pointed out that the nuances of body language and affect were often as significant as the actual content. And so what if survivors got some dates and names wrong? Their authority of witness far outweighed their mistakes. As only one of 3 survivors of the Onig Shabas archive, of the 60 people that Ringleblum brought into the archive, only 3 survived, Auerbach had the rare opportunity not just to retrieve her wartime writings, but as I said, to rewrite them after the war, with some interesting differences between her wartime and her post-war writings. When the Germans began the mass murder of Warsaw Jewry on July 22, 1942, Ringleblum calls an emergency meeting of the entire staff, and he orders everybody to hand over what they're writing, finished or not. There's no time to lose, because the Germans, with the help of the Jewish police, are deporting 7,000 Jews a day. And the Jewish police are given a quota. If you don't hand over 5 Jews in a given day, you and your family will be deported. So the Jewish police turn into bloodhounds, frantically looking for victims. All those documents that were handed in were buried on August 3rd, 1942. And they surfaced in the first cache of the archive that was discovered in September 1946. And you'll see a picture of that soon. When Auerbach handed over her ghetto writings, this was on July 26, she attached a note full of raw fear, violent anger, and despair. And here's what she's writing in part. I'm handing over this unfinished essay to the archive. The 5th day of the deportations. Perhaps such horrors have already occurred before in Jewish history, but such shame, never. Jews serving their killers. I want to stay alive. I'm ready to kiss the boots of the worst scoundrel just to be able to see the moment of revenge. Revenge, revenge, remember. In that same note, she also wondered whether her writings would share the same fate as the scribblings of a coal miner trapped in a mine explosion with no survivors, whose body would never be found. Or were her writings shared the same fate? And if by some chance her writings surfaced, would anyone care to read them? And if she survived, what good would she be to anybody? Now fast forward 2 years. It's now early 1944. She's on the Aryan side with false papers, but now she no longer has any doubt. She has to write. That was a debt that she owes to the dead. But she had to be careful, and I quote, "The mass murder, the murder of millions of Jews by the Germans is a fact that speaks for itself. It's very dangerous to add to this subject interpretations or analyses, because anything that's said can quickly turn into hopeless hysteria or endless sobs. So one must approach this subject with the greatest caution, in a restrained, in a factual manner. This is my intention, not to express, but simply to transmit, to note only facts, but not to interpret." But she quickly adds that this mandate was impossible, even for herself. She could not master her feelings. After the war, in Poland and in Israel, after she recovers her wartime manuscripts, her writing would take on yet another purpose, to ensure that the Jewish people remember, not only to keep faith with the dead, but also to use the lessons of the Holocaust to strengthen the wounded nation and to tighten the bonds between Israel and the diaspora. Auerbach left Poland for Israel in 1950, and while she had many, many difficulties in her new home, she never wavered in her conviction that after the Holocaust, Israel had become the vital center of the Jewish people. And let me add, those who erroneously see some contradiction between Yiddishism, devotion to Yiddish culture, and Zionism should consider the examples of Rokhl Auerbach, the poet Avram Sutzkever, Leib Rochman, and many, many others. Like all good reportage, Auerbach's post-war books conveyed what she saw and observed in evocative, powerful language. That makes her writings an indispensable source for the cultural and social history of the Warsaw Ghetto. And as I'll explain later, also for the phenomenology of the human experience in the Holocaust, the phenomenology. For Holocaust, for Auerbach, the first step was to describe not just what the Jewish people, to describe exactly what the Jewish people lost when the Germans destroyed Jewish Warsaw. Just after the war, Auerbach's friend, Leo Finkelstein, wrote in a book dedicated to Warsaw, Warsaw's strength, talking about Jewish Warsaw now, it derived not from Zchus Ovis, but from Zchus Otzma, not from its historical traditions like Vilna or Krakow, but from its sheer mass and power. Warsaw was a young Jewish community. It had no encrusted traditions, and therefore it could serve as a pathbreaker in the modernization of Jewish life. When Finkelstein thought of Warsaw, he emphasized the crowds, the 100,000 Jews who came to the writer Peretz's funeral in 1915, the tens of thousands who would show up for the May Day demonstrations of the Jewish Socialist Bund, the 10,000 Hasidim who would meet the Gerer Rebbe at the Warsaw train station. Warsaw had critical mass like no other Jewish community. Melech Ravitch, the Yiddish poet who'd been one of Auerbach's key mentors and closest friends, once called Jewish Warsaw a sprawling mosaic. And indeed, it was a mosaic of different Jewish tribes and subcultures, the Hasidim, Polish-speaking professionals, Litvaks from Eastern Poland, tough trade unionists, and so on, all living side by side. Warsaw, Auerbach, took the shattered bits and shards of that mosaic, and she reconstructed a tapestry of memory based on the poignant evocation of dozens of individual vignettes. And thus she spoke for those who had no one to remember them. The ordinary Jews that she came to know in the ghetto as she ran the soup kitchen on Leshno 40. And she also spoke for the Jewish writers and artists and actors whose milieu she shared in the 1930s and who she got to know better in the ghetto. And the more one knew about what and whom the Germans had murdered, the more one could grasp the enormity of the natural disaster. Much of Warsaw Testament included Auerbach's wartime and post-war descriptions of the Warsaw Jewish intelligentsia. Writers like Kalman Lis, who worked with children with special needs. Actresses like Miriam Orleska, who played Leah in the landmark Vilna Trupa production of the Dibuk. Sculptors like Avram Osjega, who designed Peretz's tomb in the Warsaw Jewish Cemetery. Composers and choir directors like David Eisenstadt. Singers like his 17-year-old daughter Marisha, who the Jews called the Nightingale of the ghetto. She would give concerts that were packed, and she was gunned down in cold blood boarding a death train to Treblinka. She described Shia Broide, her boss, in the soup kitchen, who translated Plato's dialogues into Yiddish. She writes about Yankov Gerstein, who composed a cantata based on the poetry of the Yiddish avant-garde poet Mani Leib. The religious poet Yisroel Stern, who wrote his best poetry, Auerbach believed, just months before his death. Ruta Simkovich, a saintly pedagogue who dedicated her life to helping the poor kids who went to the Yiddish secular schools. Leib Schur, a librarian who collected abandoned Yiddish books in the ghetto and who hanged himself in his library rather than go to Treblinka. She wrote about Basha Berman, who started a children's library where kids could come in, borrow books, get under a blanket to keep warm, and listen as Basha would tell them stories about faraway places that promised a better world after the war. There was the 11-year-old Yosima, who was Auerbach's cousin. She was a musical prodigy who played Mozart's 25th piano concerto in the ghetto, after which the musicians in the orchestra lifted her up as the audience applauded and applauded. If only this play had survived, that cantata, that poem. What she heard in the ghetto represented, she wrote, a flowering of Jewish genius, a bright flame just before the final destruction. As Auerbach traced the broad reach of Yiddish culture, which embraced music and the arts as well as literature, she underscored the depth of a German murder machine that destroyed a language and a culture along with the people. Before the war, Auerbach, like many Yiddish writers, had doubted Warsaw's future as a Jewish and specifically as a Yiddish cultural center. How could Yiddish survive, these writers asked, much less thrive, when in the 1930s more and more Jewish kids were going to Polish schools, and when Polish Jews were becoming impoverished through economic anti-Semitism. They were waging a desperate battle to put bread on the table. They couldn't afford to spend money on Yiddish books and Yiddish theater. Yiddish culture was going downhill. That's what she believed before the war. But after the war, she changed her mind. She explained that she had doubted the prospects for Yiddish culture before the war because she had underestimated the vitality of the Jewish masses. But in the ghetto, working in the soup kitchens, coming in close contact with not just ordinary Jews, but impressive leaders of the religious world that she never would have met had it not been for the war. She understood, as she writes, that Jewish life in the Polish provinces, and remember that the Germans kicked out 100,000 Jews from small towns and dumped them into the Warsaw Ghetto, where their situation was desperate and where they needed the soup kitchens for their daily meal. But the Jewish life in the provinces was so deeply rooted that she writes, the Jewish nation could have counted on the cultural capital of Polish Jewry for generations to come. And I quote, despite everything, we were surrounded with enormously powerful and dynamic Jewish folk masses. These masses were too numerous and too rooted in their culture to threaten the basic character of the nation. The religious strata especially constituted an enormous reservoir of human resources and spiritual energy, and they were able to make up any losses we suffered. We thought that we'd arrived in Jewish Warsaw too late. We thought the best was already over. But in fact, the first buds had faded only to prepare for a next harvest of fruit, had it not been for the terrible catastrophe that befell us. As soon as the war ended, Auerbach resolved to carry out Ringleblum's legacy, to find those tin boxes and milk cans buried under the trackless rubble of what had been the Warsaw Ghetto. The Yiddish writer Mendel Mann recalled Auerbach's talk at a third anniversary commemoration of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1946. This is still in Poland. After many tiresome speeches full of political posturing about the political significance of the uprising, blah, 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 Auerbach, the only woman on the podium, gets up to speak. And I'm quoting Mendel Mann now. She didn't make any speeches. She did not explain the meaning of the uprising. She implored with a stubbornness that deeply affected me. She demanded, she called. Remember, she cried out, there's a national treasure under the ruins. Even if there are 5 stories of ruins, we have to find the archive. I'm not making this up. I know what I'm talking about. This isn't just talk. This is coming from my heart. I will not rest. I will not let you rest. We must rescue the Ringleblum archive. Now, Mann remembered that people were not very interested at the time. They had their own troubles. But Auerbach disagreed. More than ever, the survivors had to continue the work of the Onig Shabas and record the past. She was outraged by how quickly, right after the war, everybody was rushing to score political points and to claim credit for that or the other political party. And so for Auerbach, the Onig Shabas becomes even more important. It's a model where a shared sense of national mission trumped political differences. Ringleblum is bringing together religious and secular Jews, Bundes-Zionists, communists, the famous, the not so famous, men and women, all in a common mission to collect and bury documents. Ringleblum's history teacher, Isaac Schipper, said to a fellow inmate just before he perished in Majdanek, "What we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them." What we know about murdered peoples is usually what their killers choose to say about them. And the Germans thought they would win the war, and they would determine how the Jews would be remembered, if at all. But in an amazing act of spiritual resistance, Ringleblum said, no, posterity will remember us on the basis of Jewish and not German documents. These time capsules will surface someday, even if we don't live to see it ourselves. And the murdered Polish Jews will be then remembered not as a faceless mass of victims, but as individuals with names, with identities, individuals who were part of a resilient Jewish community with hopes and dreams and agency. But Ringleblum also called on his fellow members of the archive not to pull punches, to be objective, to write about the bad as well as the good, to write about the collaborators as well as the heroes. And Auerbach took that message to heart after the war. Like much of the Onig Shabas staff, Auerbach was active in the pre-war YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute, which now I'm affiliated with. I'm just retired from Trinity. But the YIVO was a place where scholars and ordinary Jews worked together to zammel, to collect documents and build archives, to raise the prestige of Yiddish, and at the same time to use self-knowledge to empower Jews and help them in their struggle for dignity and equality. A key goal of the YIVO was to explore everyday Jewish life. As Max Weinreich, the director, had said, zu erkennen dem Heint, to learn the Jewish present through surveys, interviews, through the encouragement of personal writing, such as autobiographies. This was the modus operandi of the Onig Shabas archive, which was basically a continuation of the YIVO in the Warsaw Ghetto, because Ringleblum and the whole staff had been in the YIVO before the war. Now, Auerbach's work is following in the footsteps not just of Emanuel Ringelblum, but also of YIVO director Max Weinreich, who makes special efforts to incorporate the insights of Sigmund Freud and social psychology into the study of Polish Jewry. In the highly politicized and divided world of interwar Polish Jewry, where so many stress the primacy of the collective over the individual, Weinreich, in his youth studies project, for example, argues that one cannot understand Klal Yisrael, the Jewish collective, without grasping the needs of Reb Yisrael, the individual, the aspirations, drives, obsessions, hopes of the many individuals who made up the Jewish mass in Poland. And Weinreich was fascinated by, how does a discriminated against people educate its young people to show psychological toughness? So in 1930-31, he got a Rockefeller grant to Yale, and he spent a year at Yale, and he was fascinated with how African-American colleges in the South educated their students. This was a Jim Crow South, and he went to Morehouse, he went to Fisk, because he felt Jewish kids in Poland faced the same problem. They were told every day they were less, they were not as good. So how do you give these kids the psychological wherewithal to survive? And therefore psychology becomes all the more important in his mind. Indeed, like many other writers and memoirists of the Holocaust, Auerbach focuses not so much on recording facts and events as on evoking a social psychological study of Warsaw Jewry on the brink of the abyss. Before the war, Auerbach had majored in social psychology at Lvov University, and she'd come to know many of the Polish experts in the field. In her wartime and post-war writings, she delves into the complex interplay of psychological factors in individuals, families, and entire social groups. How does a community, how do individuals react to a slowly unfolding catastrophe, a disaster that begins in 1939 and progresses in stages? Economic ruin, the ghetto, armbands, beatings, disease, hunger, and then the mass deportation, which the Germans skillfully camouflage at first as a mere culling of unproductive elements. So, yeah, I'm sorry for you, buddy, that you're going to be deported, but I think I'm safe. So I'm just going to take care of number one. And of course, they fooled everybody. How do people experience time? How do they shield themselves from the awful truth? So Auerbach is studying the rumors, the false hopes, the illusions. She's telling a complicated story: resilience, vitality, self-sacrifice on the one hand, corruption and moral collapse on the other. She also had brilliant insights, the results of conversations with many different people in the ghetto. She's recording the rumors, the jokes, the street songs, which could be seen as a self-defense reflex. She sees them also as a poignant but powerful sign of instinctive resistance or delusion. Auerbach stresses the German skillful use of psychological factors to effect the destruction of the Warsaw Jews. And the Germans knew how to use the Jews' supposed strengths in order to kill them. They played with the Jews and with their natural human instincts of self-preservation and hope. In her brilliant observations of the mass hysteria that gripped the Warsaw Ghetto in the summer of 1942, Auerbach described how the very qualities that had served Jews so well in the past, practicality, pragmatism, hard-headedness, seichel, that is common sense, natural optimism, all these qualities now accelerated their journey into the abyss. Natural optimism. We Jews have suffered before. We've outlived all our persecutors. We'll get through this. Wir werden sie überleben. We will outlive them. Seichel, common sense. Look, let's buy time. We'll give them bribes. We'll give them gifts. We'll make boots for the Wehrmacht. Why would they want to kill us if we're so useful? And Auerbach delves into the riddle of how the Jews let themselves be fooled, how they failed to grasp the Nazi plan. And I quote, "And still other Jews, broad-shouldered, deep-voiced, with powerful hands and hearts, artisans, workers, wagon drivers, porters, Jews who with the blow of their fists could floor any hooligan who dared enter their neighborhoods. Where were you when your wives and children, when your old fathers and mothers were taken away? What happened to make you run off like cattle stampeded by fire? Was there no one to give you purpose in the confusion? You were swept away by the flood, together with those who were weak." Would other peoples confronted with a similar massive assault have acted better? She did not think so. Did Warsaw Jewry eventually recover from the shock and fight back? Yes. Should one blame the Jewish masses for not having fought back earlier? Only those who'd not been there, Auerbach implied, would do so. Was armed resistance the only way the Jews stood up to the Germans? Absolutely not. Auerbach was a superb observer of the Jewish everyday. She had a fine sense of the nuances and behavior and speech of different classes of Polish Jews, whether they lived in small towns or in urban centers like Warsaw. As I said, like Ringleblum, she was a native of Southeast Galicia, and but she's growing up in a remote village, not a shtetl, where she acquires a love of Jewish folklore and the Yiddish language. But her native village also gives her a chance to befriend her Polish and Ukrainian neighbors. And this immersion in her non-Jewish surroundings, she believed, helped her survive later on. I quote, "How did I survive on the Aryan side when hundreds of other Jews perished? It certainly was not because I was smarter. What helped me were my early years growing up in a village. Those close ties with non-Jews left a mark on my personality. What rubbed off on me was that rural Slavic temperament." So as a young woman, she moves to Lvov. She helped start a Yiddish literary journal, Zusteier. She becomes friends with Bruno Schulz, who later became after he was murdered by the Germans especially, a respected, an important Polish writer. She became friends with Dvorah Fogel. She is finally forced to move to Warsaw, and in Warsaw she becomes involved with the tempestuous Yiddish poet Itzik Manger, who was a brilliant poet when he was sober, but who was quite abusive when he was drunk. I want to also add, I'm kind of beginning to summarize here because we're getting low on time, that Auerbach, right from the beginning, suffered a great deal of misogyny. She suffered from the misogyny of much of the Yiddish cultural milieu because of her involvement with Manger, who would sometimes beat her when he was drunk. She was jokingly called the literarische Beilage, the literary supplement. She was not taken seriously as a woman, and this hurt her very much, but she kept at it. And before the war, she's already becoming a respected Yiddish journalist and critic. And much of the power of her reportage stems from her ability to navigate cultural boundaries, because her whole life straddles different worlds: village, shtetl, city, Yiddish and Polish, Poles and Jews, Galicia and Warsaw, the milieu of the Yiddish literary elite and the world of the Jewish masses, religious and secular, diaspora nationalists and Zionists. One day she could be a Yiddish writer, the next day she could pull off acting like a Polish peasant. At the end of September 1939, after Warsaw has been bombed to rubble, Auerbach is about to flee when Ringleblum calls her in and say, "Not everybody has a right to leave. I need you to stay here and help me run soup kitchens." And she then becomes a director of one of the biggest soup kitchens in the Warsaw Ghetto. And some of her best writings in the Onig Shabas archive have to do with that soup kitchen. It fed 2,000 people a day, and the story that she tells provides a gripping behind-the-scenes look at the desperate battle that the ghetto is fighting against hunger. She's investigating the social history of hunger by telling a story of a soup kitchen as a microcosm of human relationships and human choices. The dead who end up in the pits of the Jewish cemetery are not an undifferentiated mass, but they're individuals whose idiosyncrasies Auerbach records. She deftly catches the phrases or habits that make them that really make them memorable, and she's describing how while she thought she was working to help these people, in the eyes of these starving Jews, she represented authority and power. In their eyes, she'd become an arbiter of life and death. Like Ringleblum, she'd come from a milieu that was imbued with love of the Jewish masses, and now these ordinary Jews are storming her office, they're blocking her in the corridors, and they're begging for an extra bowl of soup. They're looking at Auerbach as someone who could save them. Some confronted her in silent supplication, others yelled and loudly reminded Auerbach of their former status. "I used to be a doctor." And it seems to her that the kitchen only prolonged the agony but really saved no one. The fact is that that meal in the soup kitchen provided 500 calories a day. And if that was your only meal, it would prolong the process of dying, but it would not save you. And I'm getting close to the end here. I still have a lot, but I'm going to end in 2 minutes. But I just want to read one paragraph from her essay about the soup kitchen. I remember the Coburner family, 3 sisters who managed to rescue a fine aluminum pot from what had once been a home and a life. In the early days, one of the sisters would come to get soup for all 3. Maybe the others were working somewhere. I didn't really know the family at first. Half a year later, a woman approached me. She had a chit and was carrying the pot. "My sister is sick," she told me. That happened before they organized the ghetto. Our kitchen was serving about 500 to 600 soups a day then became more. The woman who doled out the soup, Miss Helena, knew all the consumers. She served them with a smile and a warm word. She knew about their lives and their troubles. She asked the new sister how the older one was doing, and so it was, one sister took the other's place. A little while later, Helena told me that the 3rd sister was standing in the soup line. So now the 2nd sister no longer had the strength to come. Only the pot remained as before, well cleaned and glistening brightly. That pot told volumes about a way of life, about a tidy home, about the dignified decline of yet one more Jewish family. In her diary entry of August 4th, 1941, she noted, "What is the use of all our work if we can't save even one person from death by hunger?" And I think I'll stop here. There's a lot more I could talk about. What happens to her after the war, her work as a pioneer Holocaust researcher, her important work in Yad Vashem, her work in preparing for the Eichmann trial. These are all very important topics, but maybe we could deal with that in the Q&A. Thank you.
Were there some images that you also referenced earlier you were going to show, particularly on the excavation?
Right, thanks for reminding me. Thanks for reminding me.
Significance of the one you had up during your entire talk?
What?
Could you tell us the significance of the picture that we've been
Yeah,
looking
yeah.
at for the last hour?
Yeah.
Before you go on to other pictures?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. Okay. These are 2 directors of the Joint Distribution Committee standing in Warsaw in 1946. And they're standing in the former ghetto, and you see what the former ghetto looked like. there were literally mounds and mounds of rubble. And Warsaw as a whole, after the German bombing of 1939, which damaged about 20% of the buildings, and then the ghetto uprising, and then the Polish uprising of August 1944, the city was basically destroyed. The search for the archive finally began in September 1946. And there was one survivor from the archive who knew where they had buried the tin boxes and milk cans, not Auerbach. Ringleblum was obsessed with security, and therefore, only a very few people knew where the archive had been buried, in the basement of the school in the ghetto, Novolipki 68. And in Ringleblum's last letter, he said, if none of us survive, what will happen to the archive? And that was a good question, because there were only 3 survivors. The only survivor who knew where the archive was buried was Shabas, his back is to you. And he survived by a very thin margin, jumping from a train taking him to Treblinka. And then he had other escapes, but every survivor had their miracles. My mother had incredible miracles. The guy with the mustache was another early Holocaust historian named Michal Borovich, and he also survived by miracles. Now, would you believe that in 1943, Michal Borovich was hanged? He was hanged in the Janowska labor camp, but the rope broke. And the SS man, being a gentleman, so many of these officers, after their Abitur, went to Marburg and Heidelberg. He didn't believe in hanging people twice, so he pardoned. He let Borovich go back to the camp barrack, and then Borovich escaped. Now, the story of how they found the archive is amazing, because, okay, it was buried under Novolipki 68. But you saw that rubble, and you knew that you didn't even know where a street had been, much less where a particular house had been or building had been. But that spire of the church there was standing. So using pre-war aerial photographs and with surveyors and engineers, they figured out where in the rubble Novolipki 68 must have been, and it was kind of like drilling for oil. And on September 18th, 1946, they finally found the first of 10 tin boxes. That's what was buried on the night of August 3rd, 1946. Now, Wasser said, hey, wait a minute, we buried a lot more. This is just, this is nothing. But that's all they could find, and the boxes had not been sealed properly, because they were buried at a time when the Germans are only 50 yards away. None of the people who sealed them survived. So there was a lot of damage to the contents. Like, there were thousands of photographs, but only 70 survived. And they kept looking for more and more and more, but they couldn't find any. And then in December 1950, by the way, this is Rokhl Auerbach and Hirschwasser looking at the tin boxes. In December 1950, by this time Auerbach, Hirschwasser, and his wife Bluma are already in Israel. But Polish construction workers are building apartment houses in the former ghetto, and they come across 2 big aluminum milk cans. And that was what was buried at the end of February 1943. And the 2 aluminum milk cans protected the materials very, very well.
And it's 3 o'clock. Only three
What?
times.
How do I?
You can't turn that off.
Oh.
It'll be done in a second.
Okay.
They didn't change it. That's right. It is
So-
daylight savings.
So these construction workers believe, okay, the Jews have buried these milk cans. They must be full of diamonds and gold and jewels. They find they're full of papers, and they're going to junk them. But then the foreman comes back from his lunch break, and he says, no, we can't junk this, and we have to give this to the Jewish Historical Institute. Now, those milk cans contain Ringleblum's diaries, contain the writings of the Piaseczner Rebbe, contain Lewin's diaries, contain Rabbi Shimon Huberband's diaries. I mean, the number of Ph.D. dissertations that could never have been written. But no, quite seriously, imagine what would have happened to to our knowledge of the Warsaw Ghetto if that archive had not been found. None of the important books could have been written. We could have written about German policy, we could have had survivors' accounts, but we could have known nothing about the internal life of the Warsaw Ghetto. Now, according to Hirschwasser, there was a third cache buried under the brushmaker's shop just before the uprising, which later on became the site of the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. That third cache was never found. The Chinese allowed Israeli searchers to come there in 2000, but they couldn't find anything. This is Emanuel Ringelblum as a young man. This is Ringleblum, his wife, and their baby son, Yuri. This is Rokhl Auerbach as a young woman when she's editing that newspaper in Lvov, that Yiddish newspaper called Zusteyer. This is a very interesting picture. This is taken at the Second World Conference of the YIVO in Vilna in 1935. From the left, Emanuel Ringelblum, and then Itzik Monger, the brilliant poet, and then Rokhl Auerbach, and then Jacob Schatzky, who was a very important Jewish historian living in New York, came back for the conference. And then second from the right is Raphael Mahler, a very important Marxist Jewish historian. These are materials that there was a movement in pre-war Poland called Landkenntnis, which is very close to the YIVO, and Auerbach was involved in this movement because, again, in interwar Poland, the Poles, once they had their independence, even though Poland was 40% non-Polish, the Poles, most Poles saw Poland as an ethnic nation state. And the Jews were especially made to feel that they were unwanted, they were aliens, they were strangers. If they packed up and left, that would be great. And there was a movement to encourage Jews to hike, to ski, to kayak, to record the history of their towns, to take etchings from old cemeteries, to remind themselves that their ancestors had been in that land for 6-7 centuries, that they had as much right to be there as anybody else. So the Landkenntnis Society had a journal with different themes. What you see on the left is the kayaking theme. Kayaking down all the rivers and stopping at the shtetls and writing up your experiences. This was the YIVO building in Vilna before the war. This is volume 35 of the Ringleblum archive. Even though much has been lost, what has been preserved has come to 36 volumes published in Warsaw by the Jewish Historical Institute. This is Rokhl Auerbach at the right, testifying at the Eichmann trial. This is the soup kitchen. On the right is this wonderful young girl, an 11-year-old girl, Yosima, the musical prodigy, who was Auerbach's cousin, and she died in 1943. She also composed, and some of her jottings were preserved by her father, who survived and went to Israel after the war. And there will be a concert of some of those jottings of hers in New York in May, in this coming May, sponsored by the National Yiddish Book Center. As I said, very few photographs of the Onig Shabas survived. Now, as you know, the Germans sent photographing crews and film crews into the ghetto. They used the camera as a weapon to show the Jews as degenerate, dirty vermin. And so the Onig Shabas consciously tried to use the camera to create a different version of Jews who were trying to grow food, Jews who were trying to educate their children, Jews with agency. But very few of those pictures survived. This is from a classroom. This is what kids looked like who were being fed in the soup kitchens but who were slowly starving. And this is smuggling. On July 22nd, 1942, when the Germans began the final liquidation, 80% of the ghetto population was still alive, meaning that only 100,000 had died of starvation and disease. So how did those 80% survive? Because of massive smuggling. Anyway, yeah.
So we're going to open up to questions. Please.
Yeah.
Do you agree with her assessment that that the soup kitchen was best not done?
Well, that's an interesting question. She was very discouraged, and Ringleblum was very discouraged. And Ringleblum, who was head of the of the social welfare organization in the Warsaw Ghetto, he writes in his diary, if we try to feed everybody with the same portion, nobody's going to survive. Should we make a list of worthwhile people and try to feed them? Well, that's not right either. And so it was a terrible dilemma. And Auerbach got very discouraged. But after the war, Auerbach said, you know what, I was too pessimistic. Because while the soup kitchen in and of itself could not save anybody, people who had some other source of nourishment from somewhere, that made a big difference. And so she felt that she was doing important work after all.
I'm thinking of the three sisters.
Oh,
The three sisters.
yeah.
Obviously,
They
the eldest would feed the youngest to try to keep everybody going. For what you said was the oldest probably died first, then the second oldest.
Yeah.
So basically, there was hope. And since they didn't know the final solution, then that has to be a psychological advantage to people who are still alive.
Yes. They did give people hope. They gave people a reason to get out of bed. They gave people a reason to get out of bed. Now, did it save you? Keep in mind that unlike survivor testimony, where the survivors came out, they know what happened, and therefore they write based on knowing what happened, that real-time writing that you have in the ghetto, they didn't know what was going to happen tomorrow. Hitler might be assassinated. You know, the United States might drop a miracle weapon on Berlin. There was hope. You're right.
How did the
What?
11-year-old's father manage to survive?
I can't hear you.
The child prodigy,
Yeah,
pianist.
Yosima,
11-year-old,
yeah.
You said her father managed to survive.
yeah.
Do you know how he got out of the ghetto?
Yes. They were hidden in a Polish village. And by the way, had I had more time, I would have talked about Auerbach's assessment of Polish behavior, which was much more positive than what most survivors would say. But they were hidden by a Polish family. But the young girl was so ravaged by tuberculosis that she died. And they had to bury her right by the hideout. Her mother also died, and the father was the only survivor. He then came to Israel and became a high school teacher. Yeah.
Yeah, you just mentioned about Auerbach's views of the Poles, and also did any Jews go back to Poland, historians, to live after the war, or is it was just so uncomfortable?
Well, in the direction was usually one way out of Poland. that's a subject, that's a totally different subject. Now, that said, there were many important Jewish historians who stayed in Poland, like Jacob Goldberg, like Arthur Eisenbach, Moritzi Horn. Arthur Eisenbach was Ringleblum's, actually his brother-in-law. But in 1968, when you had that anti-Semitic purge of the remaining Jewish population, God forbid it was anti-Semitic, it was anti-Zionist, but 80% of the Polish Jews were basically forced to leave. These historians, most of these historians left. Auerbach, I spoke with Eisenbach, and I found him very, very depressed in Warsaw. He stayed in Poland, and he committed suicide. It's a very, very sad story. Yeah.
And the version of her version of the Poles.
Well, why? See, Rokhl Auerbach, as I said, she she majored in psychology, and before the war, she got to know many liberal Polish intellectuals and liberal Polish professors. Now, they were a tiny minority of the overall Polish population, but she knew those people, and those people helped her. And she also came to know the director of the Warsaw Zoo, Żabiński, and his wife. And some of you may have heard of this book, The Zookeeper's Wife. And Żabiński helped her a great deal. So she owed her survival to these people. And she also had a great deal of love for Polish culture. She wrote much of her wartime writings in Polish and not in Yiddish. She was totally bilingual. And when some Jewish diarist like Chaim Kaplan was outraged that the Poles chose to fight it out in 1939, instead of surrendering Warsaw, they decided to fight. And after 2 weeks, Warsaw was rubble, and tens of thousands of civilians had died. And Chaim Kaplan says, these Polish idiots, they're fighting for nothing. They're just getting people killed. Why didn't they surrender? Auerbach is saying there were Jews who mocked the Poles for fighting, but I respect them. I understand what they were trying to do. So that's the kind of writing that she, yeah.
What about with regard to smuggling? I mean, you mentioned this picture. Was she involved in any way with regard to?
No, she was not directly involved, but again, smuggling in and of itself was a fascinating subject because the skills you need to be a good smuggler, we're not talking about a little kid climbing through a crack with 5 potatoes. We're talking about the kind of smuggling that was trying to feed 500,000 people. And that's big time smuggling. Those sacks of grain, they would pay off the guards, they pay off the German guards, the Polish guards. By definition, there had to be Polish smugglers on the other side, right? So this was Polish-Jewish cooperation. But now the social capital, if it will, that makes for good smuggling, well, guess who's going to be good at it? The pre-war underworld. And Warsaw had a big Jewish underworld, and it had a big Polish underworld, and these people cooperated, and they made tons of money, but they were keeping the ghetto alive. So the question is, do you say, oh, those smugglers are not very nice people, or do you thank them? And people didn't know what to say. So there were some who said, well, those smugglers are, nothing but criminals, and others, like Ringleblum said after the war, we should erect a monument to the smuggler.
There was also smuggling out of children, with, of course, the Polish Aid Society.
Yes.
So it's another aspect of smuggling goods in and smuggling children out to a certain extent.
Yeah.
You mentioned the magazine.
What?
There was a magazine showing.
I can't hear you.
You mentioned that there was a magazine.
Yeah.
That showed like the Jews kayaking, that we were there for 7 decades. Do you remember the name?
Centuries.
The magazine you showed of the kayaking Jews.
Oh, Landkenntnis. And it was an amazing magazine. You know, cross country skiing, hiking in Zakopane, cross country skiing in the Tatras, and you know, basically, we Jews are showing by doing all this. This is our country too. They can go to hell.
Do you think that contributed to the enthusiasm for going to Israel and farming and so forth?
Among some. I mean, some were enthusiastic and wanted to go to Birobidzhan and build the Soviet Jewish state, and others were enthusiastic and had dreams of going to rural Podolia and starting farms there. So the enthusiasms went in every direction. Yeah.
Do you think that focused on being outdoors and being seen and writing those stories did anything to combat the anti-Semitism that was happening, or do you think it was largely a...
It was an attempt to fight the anti-Semitism. I mean, again, you know, the Jews in Poland, they were almost 4 million. There were a lot of them. Not only that, but while they were about 10% of the overall population, which is a lot, because when Hitler came to power in Germany, the Jews were 0.7% of the population. But in many towns, the Jews were a majority. In the towns where my parents came from, the Jews were 80%. In Warsaw, they were 40%. And so many Poles said, you know, we didn't fight for our independence against the Russians and the Germans for 100 years just so that the Jews could run our country. And so there was a great deal of anti-Semitism, and even Poles who said, I'm not an anti-Semite, but there are too many Jews in this damn country. So the Jews faced a real problem. And you know, one way of dealing with the problem would have been emigration, but emigration became very, very difficult. So then they had to come up with all these strategies. And there's a historian at the University of Chicago, Ken Moss, who wrote a book about the growing pessimism of the 1930s. There are others who still tried to be optimistic, who said we're just going to hunker down and just survive, and the Poles won't be able to force us out of here. So, but it was a very difficult situation. Yeah.
Question about how did Auerbach wrestle with her Jewish and Polish identity, especially since you mentioned that she supported like Polish resistance movements, but then also she's also dealing with like the anti-Semitism at the same time in Poland. So I guess like considering also her psychology background, like how did she wrestle with that identity between like both worlds?
Well, that's a great question. I think the honest answer is that she herself wasn't quite sure, because she, as I said, her diary was in Polish. When she left for Israel, she took with her Jastrun's biography of Adam Mickiewicz. She loved Poland. Now, at the same time, whereas in the there's a certain paradox. The paradox is that in the 19th century, you had many educated Jews who believed that they could become Polish. They could become Poles of the Mosaic persuasion. And they built this beautiful synagogue in Warsaw, the Klamacki Synagogue. In the interwar period, more and more Jews than ever spoke Polish as their first language, probably 30% by 1939, but that assimilatory dream had basically collapsed. And here's an example. The fastest growing Jewish newspaper in Poland before the war was a Polish daily, Nasz Przegląd. It was a daily for Jews. It was a great paper. It had the news, it had serial stories, it had a lot about Palestine, it had a lot about Yiddish and Hebrew literature, And its circulation kept rising as the number of Polish-speaking Jews kept going up. But ask yourself this. In New York City, at least, before the internet, Jews would read the New York Times or the Mirror or the Post, and they might subscribe to the Jewish Week to get their Jewish news once a week. What does it tell you about these Polish Jews that they feel so shut out of mainstream intellectual Polish society that they need their own newspaper? And so linguistically, more and more Jews were acculturating, but assimilation had basically collapsed. Now, Auerbach never saw herself as a Pole of the Mosaic persuasion. She was Jewish because she grew up in Lanowitz, which was not a shtetl, but it was in the heartland of, that's where the Baal Shem Tov came. That was the cradle of Hasidism. This was a solid Jewish area, but at the same time, she was fascinated not just by Polish culture, but by Ukrainian culture. And she was not a Zionist before the war. She had a brief fling with Zionism, but she was not a Zionist. She really believed in the diaspora. I think the Holocaust pushed her in the direction of Zionism. But one of the problems she had in Israel, and she had many problems in Israel, was that she didn't really join a political movement, so there's no one to protect her. In Israel, to survive, you kind of need to be part of a movement, people who are going to help you. And Auerbach was kind of a loner, and that cost her a lot. Yeah.
What's known about the archives in Auerbach in the Poland of today? Can
Well-
you read the journals in
Well,
Poland, the archives in
the
Poland?
Jewish Historical Institute has just published the entire archive in 36 volumes. And the Institute is now named after Emanuel Ringelblum, and it's all digitized. And now there's a 12-volume edition in English of selected documents. And so there's an enormous amount of outreach and education. So quite a lot is known. There's now a memorial at the place where the archive was buried and retrieved. There's also a memorial at the scene where Ringleblum and the other Jews hiding in this bunker were captured by the Germans with the help of Polish police who shared the monetary spoils with the Gestapo. There's a monument there too. So quite a lot is actually known about this.
Well, let's go ahead and thank Professor Kassow for this talk.
Yeah.